soft-spoken
Henry
has been
will
told
always
he needs
take
to
2
speak
seats.
right into the microphone
plenty of
because we
seats,
all
but I
want to
happen to
hear
be
what
here.
he has to say.
Okay, I
Okay,
don't have
Hal.
to hold these things.
The lights. Thank you.
Putin at the Crossroads. The great Ukrainian counteroffensive that seemed about to begin when last we met in May did begin. For weeks it made little progress. Russia has sown so many landmines that Ukraine can hardly sweep forward to heroic victory until the path is cleared. Ukraine is now reckoned as the most mined country on the planet. Literally hundreds of thousands of mines, anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, big mines, small mines. Even if the war were to end tomorrow, the job of clearing all the mines and making Ukraine safe for civilians to move about will take years, maybe decades. More about that later. A couple of weeks ago, NATO held a summit meeting in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. You can see Lithuania right up there. It's kind of a royal blue and next to that great big gray Russia. Yes, Vilnius, Baltic Lithuania is a member of NATO along with Latvia, Estonia, and other former Soviet constituents. The NATO membership of these countries prompts some well-intentioned folks, and perhaps some in this room, to insist that the whole Ukrainian war is not Putin's fault, but NATO's. What was poor Vladimir Putin to do, seeing all Russia's former vassals opt for freedom? NATO was interfering with Russia's right to continue dominating people who did not want to be dominated by Russia. So of course he invaded Ukraine. I mean, in Putin's place, what would you have done? Well, what's done is done, and NATO held a meeting in Lithuania. The New York Times headline was, "Despite successes at NATO summit, divisions remain."
Operator error, sorry.
You got a lot to look forward to, folks.
Okay, now, somewhere, there's a NATO meeting.
Yeah, number 3.
What?
There we are.
The New York Times headline was, "Despite successes at NATO summit, divisions remain." Well, that really pulls you in to read, doesn't it? Despite successes, divisions. Generally, I'm on board with the Times' unwillingness to go overboard in either joy or despair, but there are times when good news needs to be acknowledged. Here are 3 favorable and perhaps unexpected successes from the summit. I'm indebted for this analysis to Fred Kaplan of Sleep magazine. First, Turkey relented and assented to Sweden's bid for NATO membership. We're not here to talk about Turkey, but in recent years it has a decidedly mixed record. Its objection to Sweden's membership was that Sweden offers asylum to Kurdish refugees from Turkey, refugees whom Turkey denounces as terrorists. But apparently Turkey has decided that its bread is buttered on the non-Putin side. Good. Second, on NATO membership for Ukraine, Europe temporized, hence the Times headline about divisions. But the alliance members created a NATO-Ukraine Council, whose first meeting was Wednesday. The G7 nations, the world's richest countries, that would include Japan, agreed to a massive long-term security assistance to Kiev. Germany, reluctant since 1945 to throw its military weight around, agreed with other countries to a list of weapons to be exported to the Ukrainian army. Third, Western European countries revived their pledges to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. This has been a target, an accepted target for many years and ignored by most of the members. They seem finally to understand that this world, however much we might wish otherwise, is a naughty world. Cannot we all get along together through economic integration, buying and selling according to our specialties and our needs, as we all grow richer and more peaceful together? I myself preached many an op-ed article on this topic in the 1990s at the end of the Cold War. And I hate to give up on the vision of a secular, peaceable kingdom. You know, the lion lies down with the lamb and the Russian with the Ukrainian and so forth. Well, it took a while, but Putin is adjusting my vision and apparently also the outlooks in London, Paris, Berlin, and obviously in Sweden and Finland, as two previously neutral nations decide that their security in a malignant Russian neighborhood depends on alliance with the West, not on standing aside in the purity of non-alignment. At the NATO summit, President Biden laid out reasons why now is not the time for Ukraine to join NATO, or even for NATO to set a schedule. First, by the rules of the alliance, a nation can't join unless its borders are secure. The members need to know what they're committing to defend. And nations must meet certain standards of anti-corruption, which Ukraine, despite significant progress, so far does not meet. Finally, if Ukraine were to join now, then the other NATO countries would be committed under Article 5, the provision that an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all, to send troops and weapons to fight Russia directly. In other words, to start World War III. So here is the NATO that Putin has created. He said that he was invading Ukraine to prevent Russia's encirclement by a hostile NATO. And he ends up scaring two neutral countries in NATO membership and extending the Russian frontier with NATO by 800 miles, all that eastern Finnish border. The St. Petersburg is right pretty much to the left of the word in large letters Russia. And Kaliningrad is a little gray sliver just above Poland and below the Baltic countries. That used to be Prussian East Germany. It was founded about 1,000 years ago by the Teutonic Knights, who came there and established a kingdom, and we had Prussian German East Prussia was on the map until, I guess, maybe World War I, although it still existed. And then, but Soviet Union took that over and renamed it Kaliningrad after a earlier Soviet president. Well, that is now their Baltic outlook, and it's heavily militarized, of course, but it looks pretty skimpy. Right there is one little sliver of NATO lake, as you might call it. And from Moscow's point of view, that's not even the worst of what happened, has been happening. Finland and Estonia, right across the Gulf of Bothnia from each other, Finland and Estonia are combining their coastal defenses under unified command within NATO, but a single command for Finland and Estonia, which share a mutually intelligible language and culture. And the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, are unifying their air forces under a single command, creating an Air Force powerhouse of over 250 combat aircraft. This idea has been circulating for decades, and the obstacle was Sweden and Finland were non-aligned countries. Well, thanks to Putin, that is no longer an impediment. Back in Leo Tolstoy's time, Ukraine used to be called the breadbasket of Europe. In 1932, yeah, doesn't that look like the Ukrainian flag, the gold of the waving wheat below and the blue of the sky above? Back in 1932 and 33, Joseph Stalin starved nearly 4 million Ukrainian peasants in order to bring the grain under Soviet state control. Even in the last 12 months, as war raged around the farmland, nearly 33 million tons of wheat and corn have been exported from Ukraine under a deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey and agreed to by Russia. Turkey guaranteed free passage through the Black Sea for Ukrainian grain shipments. In return, the U.S. and the European Union exempted Russian agricultural and fertilizer project exports from its economic sanctions against Russia. China was the largest single recipient of these products, receiving almost 1/4 of them. A significant percentage went through UN food programs to Africa, making them a key resource in the fight against hunger. UN officials credit the grain deal with reducing world grain prices by 20%. Thus, cutting off the flow of grain from Ukraine could have serious implications for both grain prices worldwide and also for the availability of food in parts of Africa. Last week, Russia pulled out of the deal. Putin explained, without elaboration, that the US and Europe were not upholding their end of the deal, and thus there was no point to continuing it. Then he started bombing Ukrainian ports. Russian planes hit Odessa nearly every day this week, and as has been the Russian habit, the damage was indiscriminate. I don't mind noting that Odessa is a sister city of my native Baltimore. But I'm not the only one who values this Black Sea port. Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great. It is and built kind of to her taste, much of the historic part of it. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now smashed are port facilities, apartment buildings, historic landmarks, hospitals, and the Cathedral of the Transfiguration. Interesting fact about that cathedral, an earlier Transfiguration Cathedral was demolished by Stalin during his starvation campaign in the Ukraine. This one was built to replace it, and it was consecrated in 2010 by Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. But Kirill now staunchly supports Russia's special military operation. He has told Russian soldiers, he's reassured them, sacrifice in the course of carrying out your military duty washes away all sins. That's a quote. Heaven welcomes the soul of the faithful soldier. That's not a quote. Putin also served warning to other countries that bypassing his Black Sea blockade would be taken as an act of war. Surely this is the merest bluster. Surely Putin knows that the Grain Corridor deal didn't just protect shipping to and from Ukraine, but Russian shipping as well. Putin's bluster sets up the Black Sea as a potential newest battleground in this hideous war. Turkey's Navy could very well. This is the Crossroads Reservoir. Yeah. Turkey is a NATO member in a war that has re-attacked our Turkish ships to the Russian Navy. Hydroelectric would trigger NATO's Article 5, bringing the entirety of the alliance in southern Ukraine stands out. This is the world's largest. Canceling the grain deal is the next largest second attack. So there's a lot of water in there to flood out when the dam is punched a hole in it. Thousands of people, Ukrainians mostly, were displaced by flooding from this reservoir, which is vital for irrigating farmland. Russia's calculation in punching a hole in the dam may have had more to do with creating floods to complicate Ukraine's planned spring counteroffensive than attacking its agriculture. But now it can be seen as a double win for the Kremlin. Or can it? The Kakhovka Reservoir feeds the Soviet-era North Crimean Channel, a canal which has traditionally supplied 85% of Crimea's water. Well, that flow now has been drastically reduced, the Kremlin is saying. It insists that breaching the dam was Ukrainian sabotage intended to parch Crimea. I suppose that is possible, though would Kiev really want to displace thousands of its own citizens in the area and damage its own harvest just to make Crimean people thirsty? The New York Times investigated and determined that the evidence suggests that it was a Russian job, in that Russian forces occupy and control the area, and the blast took out an underwater support. It wasn't, lobbing a shell into it that got a lucky hit. They knew where these gates were underneath and open, and they just busted a hole in it. And all the water ran out from underneath. The water level, there wasn't water flowing over. It was the water level was just sinking as the water ran out from underneath. And when you look at it, this is a particularly nasty war. Well then, speaking of nasty, let's talk about cluster bombs.
Somehow or other, I'm not sure how it happened. But
There we
I'm
are.
all here.
Cluster munitions, or submunition weapons. Vladimir Putin was shocked and horrified the other day as he announced that Ukrainian forces had killed a Russian war correspondent, a non-belligerent citizen, with the use of cluster bombs. Well, this is pretty rich. Putin's forces have been scattering cluster munitions over the Ukrainian cities since the early days of the war. But Putin knows that much of the world regards this weapon as beyond the pale of civilized warfare, and he hopes to stir up some anger against Ukraine for using it and against the United States for supplying it. Cluster munitions, or submunition weapons, are a class of artillery shells and rocket or missile warheads that contain large numbers of smaller bombs called bomblets. You can see them in the right-hand image there. What that looks like is King Tut's casket with a whole lot of gravel in it. Well, those are the bomblets.
Grenades.
Grenades, yeah. It's like if you open a suitcase and a bunch of hand grenades fall out, exploding on contact with the ground, or a tank, or an enemy bunker. When destroying, let's say, a storage warehouse, it's often preferable to have one large warhead explode to cause the most concentrated damage. But particularly when aiming to destroy entrenched enemy infantry, which perfectly describes Russian defense positions, cluster munitions are unparalleled in their effectiveness because they can be, well, that's sort of the idea of the shotgun. You know, if you have lots of little particles coming out of the shotgun shell, it covers a wider area and you're more likely to hit the pheasant or whatever it is that you're shooting. So, cluster weapons are, yeah. So aren't all weapons designed to kill the enemy? And what is it about cluster bombs that the sensitive soul of Vladimir Putin finds so repugnant? The matter is not that soldiers die, but the danger to civilians, even long after the war is concluded. During the Vietnam War, the United States made heavy use of cluster munitions in trying to strike the transit routes of North Vietnamese guerrillas in Vietnam and Laos. Out of 260 million bomblets dropped in one Laotian province over a 9-year period, 1964 to 73, an estimated 70 million failed to explode, almost 31% failure rate. Nearly 1 in 3 of these bomblets were duds. 5 decades later, these duds, unexploded cluster bomb ordnances, continue to claim Laotian lives and limbs. Children are particularly affected as the bomb casings are so ubiquitous, and most of them are harmless, that the children have lost any sense of danger when they see signs of the bomblets. It's difficult to overstate how terrible the after effects of these weapons have been for civilians in Vietnam and Laos. In Laos alone, an estimated 20,000 people have been killed or injured by cluster bombs since the end of the Vietnam War, and 40% of those victims have been children. So in 2008, the Convention on Cluster Munitions went into force, making it illegal for signatories to use or to stockpile cluster munitions. 124 nation-states have signed the treaty. It is a treaty, not international law with universal jurisdiction. It is a convention, a code of conduct, that these countries, including Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and most of the NATO countries, have said they would respect. But most of the world's largest countries, including the US, Russia, China, India, have not signed the treaty, nor has Ukraine. There's nothing illegal about Ukraine or Russia using cluster munitions, provided they follow other rules of war in their deployment, no targeting of civilians, for example. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov listed the guidelines under which these munitions will be used, only within Ukraine, not within Russia. And we will not be using cluster munitions in urban areas, cities, to avoid risks to civilian populations. These are our people. They are Ukrainians, and we have a duty to protect them. This is an important point. As I said at the top, Ukraine is already the most heavily mined country in the world. Does anybody seriously think that whenever the fighting does end, children will be frolicking around among the war-scarred fields? Unexploded cluster bombs will be the least of the problems, with millions of buried anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, unexploded artillery shells, booby traps, conventional grenades, degraded TNT, unexploded rockets and missiles, and God knows what else. Environmental pollution will add to the dangers. The main reason to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine is that the weapons are nearly uniquely suited to the battlefield conditions Ukraine now faces. They're not particularly effective in fluid and widely dispersed combat situations. They have, for example, demonstrated ineffectiveness at suppressing guerrillas. By contrast, they're perfect for taking on entrenched conventional military forces, that is, compact defensive formations of heavily entrenched infantry that require enormous amounts of conventional munitions to dislodge. Furthermore, cluster munitions are in frequent use by Russian forces in Ukraine. Russian forces have used them not only in field combat, but in indiscriminate bombardments of Ukrainian cities, including Kiev, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and numerous other small towns and villages. Russian forces particularly target areas of civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, and electrical infrastructure. Over 50 Ukrainian hospitals have been damaged by Russian cluster munitions. So, as my mother would say, are you saying that two wrongs make a right? No. The longer the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to be fought on Ukrainian soil, the more Russian cluster bomb munitions will be deployed against Ukrainian civilians. So here's one shaky vote for allowing Ukraine to fight on even terms. You've heard the adage, generals always want to fight the last war, trusting what they learned then rather than study now how things may have changed. Well, this Ukrainian war is a banquet for future military scholars at West Point. For example, drones, yes. Tanks, no. Check the numbers. According to the Oryx database of visually confirmed destroyed Russian equipment, visually confirmed by photo evidence, this is not unreliable field reports. So if anything, it's probably an understatement. Russia has lost 2,146 tanks. Russian claims double that, 4,133. Either way, that's a lot of tanks for minimal territorial gains over the past year and a half of war. The reasons are twofold. The proliferation of shoulder-launched anti-tank guided missiles means it is difficult for armor to advance against prepared defensive positions without facing a swarm of incoming missiles. This is one reason for the slow progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Meanwhile, drones have supplanted most aircraft in threatening the tanks, the armor from the air. Who needs expensive and exposed helicopters and ground support aircraft like A-10 Warthogs when a $400 first-person blue suicide drone operated by a remote operator, first-person view in the screen, you move it around and target it, and it can deliver explosive payload against tanks. And their cheapness allows combatants to flood the zone with drones. Air power is expensive. A modern F-35, the newest NATO standard aircraft, costs around $110 million per each, including its ground support equipment. Takes about $7 million a year in basic maintenance, $42,000 per hour to fly. Gosh, think of that, $42,000 would buy 100 kamikaze drones, able to hit far more targets than that aircraft can in a 1-hour sortie. There is also the cost of the ordnance that drones are carrying. Well, that'll run into tens of thousands more dollars. The era of tank versus tank battles, which began in World War I, is over. No F-16 fighter jets, cluster bombs, no more tanks. The amount of tanks will prevent these kinds of drones or missile attacks from dominating the battlefield. War analysts Michael Kaufman and Robert Lee, fresh off a visit to the front lines, noted that the early attacks in this counteroffensive weren't probing attacks seeking Russian weak spots, but a real attempt to create a rapid breakthrough of Russian lines in multiple areas. In other words, tank attacks. But this initial phase was not a success. On the plus side, the Ukrainian General Staff recognized things weren't working and quickly reassessed their tactics. But what do these new tactics look like? Lots of infantry. Oh boy, boots on the ground, risking their lives, not push-button operatives safely at home on a 9-to-5 shift. It's coming down to a war of infantry mine clearing and infantry attacks backed by artillery and backed by drones, said Lee. What's missing from that sentence? Tanks? Russian forces aren't as effective at deploying mines, but they have a thick concentration of anti-tank guided missiles. Add Russian suicide drones and limited air power, mostly helicopters, and it's clear that any attempt to push forward with armor, with tanks, could suffer the same fate as Russia did with its own offensive capabilities in the early days of the war. Ukraine is realizing the severe limits to armor. Ultimately, this means that hopes of a massive Ukrainian breakthrough and collapse of the Russian lines won't happen, and the gains will have to be ground out, mostly by infantry. That doesn't make any gains less exciting, but it does mean that it'll take longer to accomplish. Fort Dix, New Jersey, January 1962, Army Basic Training. They showed us a movie whose title was The Ultimate Weapon, which turned out to be me, Private Harold Piper, infantry soldier, the ultimate weapon. High-tech, newfangled weapons and strategies are all very well, but boots on the ground, the lowest tech weapon in the military arsenal, the grunt soldier, is the ultimate weapon, so I was told. And now everything old is new again. The infantry, supported now by drones, which we didn't have at Fort Dix. And drones have their uses. The Ukrainian Air Force reported this week that a posse of 17 drones blew up a major ammunition depot on the supply route to Crimea. The Russians say they shot down all 17 drones. Possibly so, but not until the drones did their job. There's footage on the internet of the ammo dump blowing up. And drones keep finding new uses. What brought down last week that span on the Kerch Bridge, linking Crimea to the Russian mainland? A sea drone, a submersible, with the range to loop all the way around Crimea from east to west, a payload, or west to east, a payload large enough to bring down a span of the bridge, and the accuracy to hit it. So this is the new face of war. And one of our mercenary superstar, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Just a couple of weeks ago, he was leading a march for justice on Moscow. His aim, he insisted, was not to overthrow Putin, but to get some competent leaders to run this bumbling Ukraine war, specifically a new defense minister and a new army chief of staff. His march, strikingly, was practically unopposed. There's that map shows you down at the bottom of Rostov where it started, then there's a few things here in the middle that were pretty much where it stopped. It was 600 miles from Rostov north to Moscow, and they got within 125 miles before they stopped. They took over Voronezh, a good-sized city about halfway along the route, and then stopped. How was this possible for an insurrectionist in totalitarian Russia to go on a march like this? And then it was not that he was stopped, but simply that he did stop. Did Russian defense forces or an outraged citizenry rise up against the usurper Prigozhin? Hardly. Prigozhin's heavily armed marchers shot down a couple of Russian army planes that showed up and some helicopters, and muscled their way past some minor local mobilizations, but in places, bystanders cheered the insurrectionist forces on as they passed. Then suddenly it was all over. The announcement came that the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, had brokered a deal by which Putin and his mercenaries would be absolved of all mutinous crimes and would be permitted free passage to Belarus. This is spy novel strange. Jean Le Carré, thou shouldst be living at this hour. What would Le Carré make of this challenge of the ruthless dictator Putin from the pitiless warlord Prigozhin? And then instead of the assassination of one or the other, their subsequent accommodation. And more to the point, what should we make of it? Washington Post had a striking story Tuesday morning. Putin was paralyzed. This is a quote from anonymous Ukrainian and European intelligence officials, so take it for what it's worth. Putin was paralyzed with indecision for hours on the morning of Prigozhin's march. Even though he had been warned 2 days in advance that Prigozhin was up to something, and even though the night before the march, Putin had issued a warrant for Prigozhin's arrest for incitement to insurrection. But on that Saturday morning, Prigozhin's Wagner forces marched mostly undisturbed toward Moscow. Sir Richard Moore, Britain's MI6, chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, and possibly James Bond's boss, filled in some of the details in a speech in Prague, Czech Republic. He offered a timetable of that Saturday morning, June 24th. If you look at Putin's behaviors on that day, he said, Prigozhin started off, I think, as a traitor at breakfast. He had been pardoned by supper, and then a few days later he was invited to the Kremlin for tea. So there's some things, and even the chief of MI6 finds that a little bit difficult to try to interpret in terms of who's in and who's out. That's again his quote. Why was Prigozhin's march unopposed? No orders were issued to local commanders, so they did nothing. Washington Post reporting concluded that many on the local level could not believe the Wagner rebellion could be happening without some degree of agreement with the Kremlin. That's the trouble with having a top-down system in which you never challenge, you never question the wisdom and the authority from above. You do what you're told, and if you're not told to do anything, then you don't do anything. The Post added, still citing European security officials, the disarray in the Kremlin also reflects a deepening divide inside Russia's security and military establishment over the conduct of the war in Ukraine, with many, including the upper reaches of the security services and military, supporting Prigozhin's drive to oust Russia's top military leadership. But let me be clear, the opposition to Putin's conduct of the war comes not from a peacenik faction. These critics, beginning with Prigozhin, criticize Putin for not being ruthless enough. There's a commander on nightly home television, Vladimir Solovyov, who is ready for the war to go nuclear. Bomb Kiev, crush NATO capitals. Citations from Vladimir Solovyov. Western intelligence agencies have been reticent to comment on the failed Prigozhin rebellion for fear of providing a false backbone to Russia's familiar excuse for internal dissent, that it is arranged and stirred up by Western spies. Yet the speech by Britain's MI6, on camera, conveyed how shocking the weakness betrayed by Putin that weekend had been. He really didn't fight back against Prigozhin, Moore said. He cut a deal to save his skin, using the good offices of the leader of Belarus, referring to the intervention of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who struck the deal. Even I can't see inside Putin's head, Moore added. He has to have realized, I'm sure, that something is deeply rotten in the state of Denmark, and he had to cut this deal. Well, let me repeat that. According to Britain's intelligence chief, Putin cut a deal to save his skin. Consider the source, a highly paced Brit in a position to know, but also in a position to spin the story to the advantage of Ukraine or the Western allies, or to spin it in hopes of weakening Putin's position within the Kremlin. I'll leave it there for the time being, but Sir Richard is not alone in his analysis. The very fact that Prigozhin is free at large, not arrested, that he has not accidentally fallen out of an open 10th-story window, as other critics of Putin have done, suggests that Putin is playing his hand very cautiously. And what of Prigozhin himself? The Russian government apparently confiscated much of the Wagner fighters' heavy weaponry and transferred it to the regular army. Wagner will no longer fight in Ukraine. From one point of view, that news might be seen as unfortunate because Prigozhin's mercenaries may have been the most cohesive, effective fighting force on the Russian side in Ukraine. Many of the Wagner fighters are now in western Belarusia, near the Polish border, training the Belarusian armed forces to defend their country against an imagined Polish invasion. Oh, give me a break. Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries, by the way, have been around for nearly 20 years. They've been doing Putin's dirty work in the Syrian civil war. Wagner's been providing military and security support as well as propaganda assistance in at least half a dozen African countries, most notably Mali, Libya, Central African Republic. In return, Wagner has received lucrative contracts for mining and logging rights from these countries. A private Russian security company said this week that several hundred Wagner fighters had arrived in the Central African Republic to secure a referendum taking place tomorrow. The vote is on a change to the constitution that would enable the president, Faustin Archange Touadera, to seek a third term. Putin himself has said, in the midst of the Prigozhin mutiny, that Russia paid Wagner at the equivalent of $2 billion last year, adding ominously, "We hope that none of the money has been misappropriated," i.e. diverted into Prigozhin's pocket. Away from the battlefield, it appears that all is not well with Russia's armed forces. In recent days, some top generals have been reshuffled or sacked. At least one, Sergei Surovikin, may have been too friendly with the insurrectionist Prigozhin, who often complimented him. Others may have endorsed even tacitly some of Prigozhin's criticisms of the top brass's conduct of the war. There may also be a manpower shortage. This week, the government rushed through a law to raise the draft-eligible age from 27 to 30. A section of the legislation bars men in that category from leaving the country. Putin has said that there's no need for general mobilization because the aims of the special military operation, he never utters the word war, these aims are limited and things are going well. Why did he need to expand the draft pool then? Casualty rates are high. Here's a chart detailing by rank 2,445 officers who've died in the war as of July 1st. 6 generals, 68 colonels, and so on, down to 1,200 lieutenants, senior and junior. Another general has died since then, shot during his morning run.
Yes.
He doesn't sound like the brightest bulb in the chandelier. It seems that he routinely posted on an app each morning's running route. Apparently some Ukrainian found the app and ambushed him. Al Jazeera, the Arab news site, a couple of weeks ago reported a figure of nearly 50,000 Russian war dead since the beginning of the war. The figure comes not from either Moscow or Kiev, but from a statistical analysis by 2 independent Russian media outlets, Media Zona and Medyuba, working with a data scientist from Tübingen University in Germany. They combed through Russian news reports about obituaries and funerals and the like to come up with this estimate. And the British Defense Ministry concludes that Russia almost certainly is struggling with a crisis of combat medical provision. It estimates about 400 Russian casualties a day, killed and wounded, since February of last year, when the invasion began. Today is the 521st day. So 500 days times 400 daily casualties works out to 200,000? The ministry goes on to report that as many as 50% of the wounded die for want of timely medical care. But if you want to know why Putin really may be on thin ice, consider this report from Vyedomosty, the Russian daily business paper, the Wall Street Journal of Moscow. Counterfeit vodka sales skyrocket in Russia. How do you counterfeit alcohol? Can you get drunk on counterfeit alcohol? If not, why buy it? What do you suppose it is made of? The newspaper, citing government statistics, says that due to falling incomes and Western economic sanctions, Russians are switching to ersatz befuddlement. Sales of cognac and brandy in the first 6 months of the year fell by 20%. Sales of vodka by 16.5%. Remember Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet reform leader of the 1980s? His heart was in the right place, but when he cracked down on vodka production and consumption, that was the last straw. Suddenly, sugar disappeared from store shelves. It had all been intercepted by moonshiners brewing bathtub vodka. Even in a communist country, entrepreneurs will spring up to meet market demand. But with no sugar, now even teetotaling tea drinkers became as furious with poor Gorbachev as the booze hounds. Gorbachev died last August at age 91, yesterday's forgotten man. A word to the wise, Mr. Putin. But Putin's not suffering too much. CNN did a special the other day about his luxury train. He has several private personal airplanes, of course. But the problem with airplanes is that international conventions require all air traffic to be tracked and recorded. So now Putin apparently moves about mostly in his 20-some car armored train. The Russian leader is famously known as a workout freak, so there is a gym, of course, and also a spa and bath, and a skin care and massage area, and a meeting room for high-level confabs. The train is pulled by 2 locomotives. I'm not sure that's clear in this picture, 2 locomotives. A train can escape aviation regulations, of course, but interestingly, it cannot escape railroad hobbyists. Some kids, back when we were young, were obsessive about trains. They would haunt rail crossings and record the identification numbers of passing trains with the idea of cataloging all the runs on the route and see who was the first to say that I've seen all of them. Passenger, freight. Well, this is still true in Russia today. So a lot of what we know about how Putin gets around at ground level comes from hobbyist train spotters. Enough frivolity. When is this hellish war going to end, and how? Turn it over to the diplomats, some nervous Europeans urge, and many Americans too, especially on the left. In May, the New York Times published a full-page ad with the headline, "The U.S. should be a force for peace in the world." Well, I don't disagree with that. It was signed by 14 luminaries from military services, academia, and government. I knew one of them from my time in Moscow, Jack Matlock. He was then the #2 in the U.S. Embassy and later served as ambassador. Jack seemed to me a pretty level-headed guy. The signatories to the ad deplore violence, war crimes, and so on. They strongly condemn Putin for the war, but they argue that only diplomacy can bring a solution. A striking graphic accompanying the article shows the NATO military bases in Western Europe adjacent to Russia, counterposed with another graphic titled, "What if the shoe were on the other foot?" Imagining Russian bases in Canada and Mexico threatening the United States. This is all very fair and balanced, but it's a false comparison. The fact is, Canada and Mexico, whatever problems we may face from time to time, are not adversaries. The shoe is not on the other foot. You can find historical examples of American domination, but please tell me, which of our imperial adventures in this, the 21st century, compares with aggressive Russian wars in Georgia, Chechnya, Moldova, not to mention biting off pieces of Ukraine since 2014? The signers of the New York Times ad reflect Henry Kissinger's realist view of foreign affairs. Their mantra is a quote attributed to Thucydides, the Greek historian of 25 centuries ago. The strong do as they will, the weak suffer as they must. Might makes right. The great power Russia has its sphere of influence. Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, and the others have no power or right to order their own affairs. They are in Russia's sphere of influence and must remain in that sphere, and we must understand and accept that. Might makes right. At the very same time, another op-ed piece blamed the Ukraine war on Germany. It seems that the West has not been trampling over Russia's interests, but catering to Russia by establishing trade ties, by becoming dependent, as Germany did, on Russian natural gas, and so on, while the wily Putin plays us for simpletons. This is all true, but in the early post-Cold War years, the enlightened policy, so we thought, was to integrate the East and West, yes, by Russian gas, make us interdependent on each other. I would like to introduce this German critic of the soft approach to Jack Matlock's diplomats, critics of the hard approach. Wouldn't it be fun to hear them try to enlighten each other? Back to diplomacy, respecting Russia's sphere of influence. Under this reasoning, diplomacy offers no way out, but only a restoration of Russia's neighborhood hegemony. Some wars end in victory, the loser gives up, and the diplomats work out the aftermath. In a stalemated war, as this is at the moment, the warring sides have an incentive not to negotiate, but to escalate. Maybe we can improve our position. For Putin, keep bombing until they quit. For Zelensky, keep fighting until they realize that we will never quit. A ceasefire in place, with negotiations to follow, means that post-war Russia will occupy about 20% of Ukraine's 1991 boundaries and can stonewall until it gets what it wants or is strong enough to attack again. It's hard to see a diplomatic exit here at the moment, so long as both sides want to win and think that they might win. That said, we do need to be more cognizant of Russia's sense of itself in the world, its paranoia, its megalomania, its inferiority complex, its hypersensitive and anachronistic anxiety about encirclement. In international politics, as in physics, every action has a reaction. And in those halcyon days after the Soviet collapse, we were not sufficiently aware of the somnolent Russianism, as I came to think of it, that fierce nationalism that was hibernating under the surface of heady pluralism and pro-Westernism. It was always there, this Russianism, and now we see its fury unleashed. Although we can't blame ourselves for Russia's complexes, it would have been good to avoid missteps that helped turn those complexes into policy. One problem in analyzing this is that NATO expansion cannot fully explain Putin's rationale in invading Ukraine. It doesn't speak to his notion of Ukraine as essentially Russian, his selective mining of great Russian history, fanciful though it may be, his ambitious drive to recreate as much of the Soviet Empire as possible. Was this animating vision truly sprung in Putin's mind because Russia's neighbors chose to join NATO? Jack Matlock, the American diplomat I knew and liked when I reported from Moscow, Jack once said, this is almost 50 years ago, that his job, negotiating with Russia, would be a lot easier if only the Kremlin acted in accordance with its own interests, instead of acting against those interests. And so we have this strategic genius, Vladimir Putin, having bitten off in Ukraine more than he can chew. He has succeeded in revitalizing NATO, creating more encirclement of his country. You see again, NATO Lake. More hostility to it, more isolation of it on the international stage. A wounded bear is a dangerous bear. Beware. Then again, perhaps Putin's fondest dream is that Jack Matlock and the diplomats will bail him out. Here's how that might work. We're fantasizing here, folks. This is fantasy. Let's say that Ukraine does force Russia to withdraw its troops. The two sides glower at each other across the line, and then nothing much happens. Like the Korean War, there's an armistice but no peace treaty.
Lost the image.
I know. Thanks. I'm going to go back to something right back where we started.
Right back where we started. Okay, Russia withdraws, and then nothing happens. Like the Korean War, there's an armistice but no peace treaty. Because Russia fails to sign on any kind of dotted line, Ukraine cannot complete its entry into NATO. Remember, one of the conditions of NATO accession was stable borders. But without a peace treaty, these are still in dispute. Putin has to know that signing onto a peace agreement, even one that seems somewhat favorable, is likely to land him exactly where he has loudly claimed that he didn't want to be in the first place, facing a Western-oriented Ukraine, allied with NATO and the European Union. Sitting back in an uneasy situation where either side lobs a missile across the border now and then, that might be Putin's best outcome. Thank you.
You want lights?
Yeah, can we get lights?
I believe that one of the downfalls of the Soviet Union was that the Russians populace finally learned about all the casualties in Afghanistan, the war that was hidden from them. How is the present casualty rate affecting the populace and their support of Putin?
I would say that you're right about Afghanistan. That probably was one of the factors involved, not necessarily the only one. Well, it's hard to know about public opinion in Russia. I think there are still polls that show the majority of people support him. But of course, the more soldiers are, if they really have lost 50,000 soldiers, that's 50,000 mothers who are very unhappy. So it's hard to believe. I think that's one of the reasons that he keeps refusing to actually call a draft and mobilize. One of the things he's done, curious enough, is he's put the muscle on the larger Russian companies, the ones that are very dependent on state support. Gazprom, the gas company, and Roscosmos, the space agency. And some of the foreign companies there. Unilever is one of them. Unilever is a big multinational consumer conglomerate. And these and other countries have been ordered by the Kremlin to beef up their security forces. Well, every company has got some security guards moving around and that sort of thing, but this is sort of strange that they beef up their security guards who then come under the control of the Russian army. In other words, it sounds like a subterfuge to try to make people believe that he's not mobilizing all that many troops. Security. Everybody needs security forces, and so I don't really know, but that surely must be one of the great concerns. Is Russians are very sensitive, as anybody is, to war losses. Oh, they talked endlessly when I was living there, 30 years after the end of World War II. They would talk endlessly about the huge sacrifices that we made, but it was all worth it because we defeated Hitler. Well, what are they fighting for now? If we can't even decide whether Prigozhin is a traitor. So you put your finger on a very important question. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
I think Joe had his hand up first, Lori.
Okay.
Right?
One of the commentators, a historian of Russian military, suggested that we don't really have to provide an off-ramp for Putin, that in Russia, if things aren't going well, you just change the story. And so we'd be interested in your view as to whether or not, Putin could just ignore failure and go on to do something else.
Well, ultimately, I don't think he can, because some of this, you're right, this off-ramp business, there was a lot of talk about it in the first months. We have to allow him to save face, give him something that he can call a victory. I think it's too late for that, and I don't think he wants that kind of an off-ramp, under those circumstances. Yes, change the story, of course, and the story has been changed several times already. But can there be such a thing in public opinion? Well, every few hundred years, I suppose, there's a revolution, but it takes quite a lot to get it going. Communication is better now than it ever was. There are ways to get, for people who care and who can have the technology for it, there are ways inside Russia to evade the state propaganda and actually get onto the internet. The average, Ivan and Masha, they don't necessarily do that, but there are a lot of people who can do. Just as there were people who would figure out ways to avoid radio jamming of the Voice of America and Radio Liberty back in the Soviet days. Most people didn't, but there were always a few people who really did have a pretty good idea what was going on. Well, we hope that reaches critical mass.
I'm kind of interested in Crimea particularly. I've seen a couple of articles by, what are they called? Yul Brynner was one.
Yul Brynner?
Not Tartars, but Tartar.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one was a woman who was Tatar, who said, everybody's afraid of us. We're not accepted. We're sort of like the gypsies or Roma in Spain, that you can't live with them and you can't live without them. And as I said, the only one I ever knew was Yul Brynner, who was an absolute prima donna. But what is this? Like in 2014, Crimea was taken and people said, oh, boo-hoo, and did nothing. And it seemed to be a kind of handoffish thing.
Yeah, it was. There are several reasons for this. Yes, it was. Tartar, a number of waves swept across from the east. Well, there's Genghis Khan, for example, who swept in both directions. Mongols, Tartars, and Tatarstan, Tartary, and Central Asia back in the Middle Ages, and these migrations or invasions were going on. And Crimea, yes, it was occupied and became a part of the Tartar Empire, which eventually drifted into Turkish hands. The Turks came out of eastern Siberia. They were one of those migrations too. But Stalin didn't trust them. It was just like what you're saying, I guess. Deported them all back out into Siberia back during the war. And peopled the place with Russians, mostly Russians. So in fact, in 2014, there were probably more Russians than there were Ukrainians living in Crimea at the time. Well, how come Crimea became a part of Ukraine? Well, geographically, it's the proximity. But Khrushchev did that. Back in the 1960s, he made a present of Crimea to Ukraine. It had actually, in the original borders, it was part of Russia. But Khrushchev was a Russian who had been born in Ukraine, so he kind of understood, I guess, the demographics there. But since all the shots were called in Moscow and the Kremlin anyway, it didn't really matter where the border was. So this was a goodwill gesture to Ukraine to give it the now Russian-occupied, formerly Tartar-occupied Crimea. So that's one reason why the world did kind of shrug in 2014. First of all, what were we supposed to do about it? And secondly, if you had a vote of the people, it's very possible, and now entirely likely, that the populace would have voted to join Russia.
Henry and then Barry.
Henry.
I was just curious, one of your slides, there was a little region between Poland and Lithuania that was not marked as belonging to either country. What is that?
It's part of Russia. I thought I did mention it a little bit. Kaliningrad. It's the former Prussian East Germany. It was founded by the Teutonic Knights about 1,000 years ago. And it's been
part of one country or the other now?
Yes, it's part of Russia. They didn't, when they...
It's part of Russia that's detached from Russia?
An exclave, yes, detached from it. And it is a huge naval base there. Because actually it's hardly anything else in Russia has a Baltic face to it now. One reason why they tried to hold on to the Baltic countries after in the 30s and 40s.
I had the idea that East Prussia was a little bit farther to the west.
No, I don't think so. I think that was it. Königsberg, and Immanuel Kant was born there.
Thank you. Hal, if Putin's political base consists of the oligarchs that are very powerful, and he's made such outrageous mistakes, such as being unable to topple a much smaller country and strengthening what he regards and has sold as a NATO encirclement. If all of that's true, you say he's on thin ice, is it more likely that he's doomed and not going to last very much longer?
I was being somewhat facetious because the thin ice comment was in respect to synthetic alcohol.
Listen, as a purchaser of synthetic tin.
These are Russians after all, aren't they? Yeah, the oligarchs, before Putin, during the Yeltsin days, a lot of the state property, in effect, was sold off to private enterprise, which actually just became, kind of like the United States back in the 1890s before antitrust law came in, and why antitrust law came in. Yeah, they have hands in everything. And they are, Putin, when he took over, saw them as a rival source of power. And so a couple of them, I think one of them fell out of the 10th floor window or down a staircase or something. Another one got jailed, and this happened to 2 or 3 people, and the rest get the message that if you want to continue to run your multinational, billion-dollar company and live the sweet life, you can do that, but you have to acknowledge the supremacy of Vladimir Putin. And so they mostly do. But of course, they must have some breaking point. You'd think that may be potentially even as important or more important than 40,000, 50,000 grieving mothers.
Where can I get some counterfeit vodka?
You have to make it in your bathtub.
High sugar. I don't have a bathtub.
Too bad for you. May.
Let's see, there was a mass exodus of military-aged young men, and there is a loss of a large number of young men of working age. Is this having an impact on the Russian economy?
Yes, you would certainly think so, and I believe it has. The couple of things have, certainly that would be one impact on the Russian economy is the loss of all those young men in the productive economy. But in addition to that, of course, there have been Western sanctions. It's been difficult for Russia to maintain its trade ties. The sanctions were something that, to some extent, they take a while to kind of kick in. Supposing you are a European country and it's getting to November and you have to make sure there's enough heating oil around. You've got a contract with Russia to supply it. Maybe you don't want to break that contract until next spring. So there has been a certain amount of that sort of thing. On the whole, a lot of Europe's critics who think that they're not going to give up the soft life for Ukraine, for heaven's sake, they proved wrong. I think people were surprised at how much backbone Europe has shown for the Ukrainian people. After all, they're not like us. They're Slavs. But again, just as the oligarchs may have an end to their patience, some of the people in Europe really are talking about, well, now, isn't it time really to get the parties to the negotiating table? Is that really because they're worried about the sanctions? Or is it just because they'd like to see the war end? But there's no question that I've seen some statistics, and maybe I should have marshaled some on outside estimates. It has to be outside estimates because you can't, you're not going to get Putin to stand up and give the right figures. That the Russian economy has contracted in the last year and a half, maybe as much as 10%. It won't be quite a recession, if so. China has helped, of course, by continuing to buy Russian products. There's some limit even to that. If they can't ship oil to Europe, maybe China will buy it. Well, yeah, but there aren't any pipelines. or maybe a few small ones, but China has not been.
If NATO
huge
was to take an
was willing
even
to
more
take it
aggressive
to help out, then you've got
anti-Russian
Putin.
stance, what allies could Russia count on?
Well, Belarusia for sure. But I think they would. Well, they're making diplomatic efforts in Africa now. Well, so what? Africa's not going to send them anything. I mean, this is just to show that they're still a great power. China has given some economic support, but they've not really been shipping weapons to it, and they're not going to. I'm quite sure that they're not going to enter the war on Russia's side, even if Putin is fighting all of NATO at the same time. But so I don't know. He's at a crossroads. He's going to. He must be thinking about his own isolation in this war.
Painted himself into a corner. It's on, okay. Thank you, Hal, so much.
Well, thank you. You've been a good audience, and I would like to also honor my associate here. Karen found all those slides for me, so put it together. There may have been a glitch or two in the presentation, but it wouldn't have happened at all without Karen.
We saw to a week, same time, same place. Fred Menifee is going to do parts 2 and 3 of his University District and University of Washington history. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming, and thanks again.
Putin at the Crossroads.